In a courtroom filled with tension, the air seemed to hum with an unspoken anxiety. The judge, a man in his late 50s, sat at the bench, his gaze cold and unwavering as he reviewed the case before him. He had been known for his quick decisions, always leaning toward harsh sentences, especially when it came to certain types of defendants. Today, he looked down at the woman standing before him, a black woman dressed in simple clothes, looking calm but uncertain. She stood tall, her hands folded neatly in front of her, waiting for the judge to announce her fate. She had been accused of a crime, and it was clear that the judge's decision was already made. The woman's face revealed little, yet anyone who looked closely could see the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Her eyes were focused, determined not to let the stress show. She knew that the judge had already made up his mind based on his own assumptions. She was just another name on a list, another face in the crowd. As far as he was concerned, the courtroom was filled with murmurs from the audience, some people whispering to each other, while others waited in silence, knowing how the system worked. They all knew the reputation of this judge. He was known for his biased rulings. He had a history of treating certain defendants unfairly, making snap judgments based on their race or background, rather than the facts of the case. This woman, however, was different. Despite the judge's bias, she carried herself with an air of quiet dignity that seemed to make the room tense with anticipation. The judge, oblivious to the woman's calm composure, began to speak. His words were laced with condescension, as though he already knew the outcome of the case before hearing any defense. He spoke of her crime in cold terms, listing off the supposed evidence with little emotion. It seemed as though he was simply going through the motions of a trial he had no intention of letting play out fairly. As he spoke, the woman stood still, her gaze unwavering. She didn't plead for sympathy or beg for mercy. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the judge, not with anger, but with a silent strength. She knew that her fate rested in the hands of a man who would not see her for who she truly was. Instead, he saw only the surface, the color of her skin, the assumptions he had about her background. Despite all of this, the woman didn't falter. She knew the injustice that was unfolding in the courtroom, but she had learned long ago how to navigate these situations. Her life had been filled with challenges and adversity, but she had never let it break her. She had always been determined to rise above the assumptions others had about her. Today, though, it felt as if the very system she had worked so hard to overcome was trying to tear her down. As the judge continued to speak, her mind wandered briefly to the countless times she had been judged based on her appearance, her race, or her gender. It wasn't new to her. In fact, it was something she had learned to accept as part of the world she lived in. But today, it felt different. There was something about the way the judge spoke to her, something about the way he saw her as nothing more than a stereotype, that made her feel even more determined to stand tall, no matter what was coming next. The judge, unaware of the inner strength of the woman before him, was about to make a decision that would change everything. He had no idea who she really was or the impact she had already made on the world. In his mind, she was just another defendant, a face to be judged and sentenced. But the woman, standing silently, had already proven something that the judge would soon learn. She was far more than he could ever have imagined. The judge, sitting high above the rest in his courtroom, had long held certain biases. His reputation preceded him, known for his quick, dismissive judgments, particularly when it came to people of color. He had spent years on the bench, building a track record of rulings that reflected his own narrow views of the world. There was an unspoken sense of authority in his presence, a belief that his position gave him the right to decide who deserved justice and who did not. To him, there was a clear distinction between those who were worthy of his favor and those who were not. Today, as he looked down at the black woman standing before him, he assumed he knew everything he needed to. She was just another defendant, caught up in a case he could quickly close. In his mind, he didn't need to look beyond her appearance, her skin color, or her background. He had seen people like her before. It wasn't hard to imagine the kind of life she must have led. Poor, troubled, likely involved in things she shouldn't have been. In his eyes, she was already guilty, and the evidence, whatever it was, seemed irrelevant. He had made his mind up. He had always believed that his position as a judge placed him above scrutiny, that his decisions were final, and that no one could challenge his authority. After all, who could question a judge with so much experience? The system had been built on respect for his position, and he expected everyone to bow to that respect. His decisions were supposed to be final, unquestionable. But today, standing before him was a woman who, in his view, had no real place in his world. She didn't belong in his courtroom. To him, she was just one more person to be dealt with quickly, without much thought. The judge didn't think for a second that the woman might be someone more than what he saw. He didn't think that she might be someone who had fought her way through a world that had constantly tried to put her down. Someone who had overcome the odds to become someone influential, powerful, and respected. He couldn't have known that, in just a few moments, everything he thought he knew would be turned upside down. Instead, he continued to follow his usual routine, his eyes flicking from the papers in front of him to the woman standing in front of him. The words flowed out of his mouth without much emotion, his voice cold and robotic. He wasn't interested in hearing her side. He wasn't interested in the context of her life, her struggles, or the reasons behind her actions. He was too focused on what he had already decided. The judge was lost in his own prejudices, blind to the fact that the woman in front of him was more than he could have ever imagined. As he spoke, there was an unsettling silence in the room. The woman stood still, not showing any sign of fear or frustration. She didn't protest or raise her voice. She didn't try to argue with the judge or demand that he see her differently. She simply stood, waiting, with a calm and quiet strength that spoke volumes. The judge, unaware of the woman's true identity, continued to deliver his biased judgment, unaware of how much he had already underestimated her. He believed his decision was final, but in truth, it was only the beginning of a story that would change everything. The courtroom, filled with its usual mix of tension and anticipation, had no idea that they were witnessing a moment that would reveal the flaws in the very system that was supposed to ensure justice. The judge, too wrapped up in his own prejudices, had no idea that his assumptions would soon be shattered in a way he could never have predicted. The judge, confident in his decision, barely looked at the woman as he finished speaking. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, making a quick note before he prepared to pass sentence. His words were firm and without hesitation, as though he was certain that he had already made the right choice. In his mind, the case was closed. The woman, in his eyes, was just another statistic, a person who didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But the woman remained calm. She didn't respond to the judge's harsh words with anger or resistance. She stood there quietly, her hands still folded in front of her, her face composed and serene. There was no sign of fear or frustration. She simply took in the moment, her expression unwavering. Despite the unfairness of the situation, she knew better than to let her emotions take control. She had been in situations like this before, where people made assumptions about her, where the world saw her through a lens of prejudice. But she had learned to rise above it. She wasn't going to let the judge's ignorance define her. The judge didn't seem to notice the woman's composure. He was so absorbed in his thoughts, so confident that he was in control, that he missed the deeper strength she was showing. He couldn't see that, beneath her calm exterior, there was a fire of determination. She wasn't just a defendant to him. She was someone who had overcome more obstacles than he could ever imagine. But the judge didn't know that. He was too focused on his own assumptions and his belief that he held the power in this room. As the judge prepared to deliver his sentence, he looked up from his papers and turned his attention back to the woman. He seemed ready to move on, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But just before he could speak, there was a shift in the room. A lawyer, or perhaps a clerk, stood up and whispered something in the judge's ear. The judge, momentarily distracted, raised an eyebrow in surprise. He wasn't sure what he had heard at first, but whatever it was, it made him pause. The woman's identity had been revealed to the judge in that instant, and the shock on his face was unmistakable. He looked at her again, this time with a hint of disbelief in his eyes. The calm, composed woman who had stood in front of him for the last several minutes was not who he had thought she was. She wasn't just another defendant from a lower social class, as he had assumed. No, she was someone far more significant than he had ever imagined. The woman was not just a regular person in the courtroom. She was someone well-known, highly respected, and influential. The judge was stunned. The woman was not just a victim of the system. She was someone who had worked tirelessly to build a life for herself, someone who had made her mark in the world, despite the odds stacked against her. In a flash, the judge's entire perception of the woman changed. The person standing before him was not just a defendant to be sentenced. She was someone who could reshape the very system that had failed her. But the woman didn't let the shock of her identity change her demeanor. She stood still, as calm as ever, waiting for the judge to process what he had just learned. There was no gloating in her posture, no satisfaction in her expression. She wasn't here for revenge or to prove anyone wrong. She was here because, despite everything, she had to face this moment. And she would face it with the same grace and strength that had carried her through every challenge in her life. The judge, now faced with a reality he never expected, was forced to reconsider his previous actions. The woman before him was not just someone he could dismiss. She was someone who had already proven herself in ways he hadn't even begun to understand. The moment the judge learned who the woman standing before him truly was, the room seemed to shift. For a brief second, everything around him felt like it had slowed down. His mind raced as he processed the information. He had been completely unaware of the woman's true identity. And now, the weight of his hasty decision pressed down on him. He felt a wave of shock and disbelief wash over him. The woman was not just anyone. She was someone of significant importance, someone whose name carried weight in the world outside this courtroom. At first, the judge could hardly believe it. How could he have missed something so crucial? How could he have been so blinded by his own prejudices that he failed to recognize who she really was? He had made assumptions about her based solely on her appearance, and now those assumptions were coming back to haunt him. The judge's heart raced as he tried to process the information, but it wasn't just the revelation of her identity that rattled him. It was the realization that, in an instant, he had done something that could cost him everything. The woman, meanwhile, remained still, her expression unchanged. She didn't seem surprised by the judge's reaction. She had known that this moment would come sooner or later. She had always carried herself with the knowledge that she was more than what people saw on the surface. Her calm demeanor didn't show any signs of arrogance, but there was a certain quiet power in the way she stood. She wasn't interested in seeing the judge squirm, but she was fully aware of the change happening in the room. She had been underestimated time and time again. And now, the judge had to face the consequences of that. The courtroom, still filled with the lingering tension of the earlier proceedings, seemed to hold its breath. The audience watched the judge's stunned expression, waiting for him to react. The sudden shift in atmosphere was palpable, and no one was sure what would happen next. Would the judge admit to his mistake, or would he try to ignore the reality of the situation? Finally, the judge cleared his throat, trying to compose himself. He glanced at the woman again, his gaze more carefully scrutinizing her now. The self-assuredness that had once defined him seemed to slip away, replaced by a sense of uncertainty. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He had always believed that he held all the power in his courtroom, but in this moment, it was clear that the power had shifted. He could see now that this was no ordinary case, no ordinary defendant. After a moment of hesitation, the judge took a deep breath and began to speak, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried before. He apologized, though it was more of an automatic response than a genuine expression of remorse. The apology felt almost mechanical, as though he was saying the words because he knew he had to, but not because he truly understood the gravity of what had happened. The woman's identity was not just a surprise to him. It was a reflection of everything he had missed, everything he had misunderstood about her. Despite his apology, the woman remained composed. She had no interest in hearing empty words. She had learned long ago that apologies from people who didn't understand the depth of their wrongdoings meant very little. She wasn't here for his remorse. She was here for justice. Her path had always been one of resilience, and the judge's reaction only confirmed that she had made the right decision in standing tall, no matter what he thought of her. The judge, now fully aware of the woman's identity, began to question everything he thought he knew about justice. His moment of realization had left him rattled, and for the first time, he began to truly see the flaws in the system he had long believed in without question. As the judge processed the revelation about the woman standing before him, his mind was a whirlwind of confusion, regret, and disbelief. He had always prided himself on being a man of principles, someone who upheld the law without bias, or so he believed. But in this moment, he realized just how deeply his assumptions had influenced his actions. He had treated the woman before him as if she were just another defendant, someone easily dismissed, someone whose life didn't matter. He had never bothered to truly see her, never considered that she might be more than the surface appearance he had judged her by. Now, faced with the truth, the weight of his decision was overwhelming. He had sentenced a woman who, as it turned out, was far more influential and accomplished than he could have ever imagined. The shock he felt was not just about her identity. It was about the realization that he had acted in ignorance, that he had been part of a system that perpetuated bias, even from the highest authority in the room. The woman, however, showed no signs of gloating or satisfaction. She wasn't interested in making the judge feel bad or rubbing his mistake in his face. Her purpose was not to see him squirm, but to make him and everyone else understand the consequences of their actions. She had been in this position before, where people assumed things about her based on the color of her skin, her background, and the way she carried herself. She had learned not to react emotionally to such things, but instead to rise above them. Today was no different. She wasn't here for an apology. She was here because, despite everything, the world needed to see the flaws in the system, and this moment was a reflection of that. The judge cleared his throat again, trying to find the words to address the situation. It was clear that he was struggling. For the first time in his career, he was questioning everything he thought he knew about justice. He had always believed that the law was the law, that it was clear-cut, that it was a tool for fairness. But standing before him was the undeniable evidence of how biased his view had been. His mistake wasn't just in the sentencing. It was in his failure to understand that justice couldn't be blind if it was going to be truly fair. Finally, the judge turned to the woman and spoke in a tone much softer than before. "I apologize," he said, though his voice still carried a tinge of uncertainty. The words felt almost hollow, like an automatic response that came too easily, without the depth of understanding needed to make it meaningful. The woman didn't respond to him immediately. She had heard these words many times before, from people who didn't truly understand the harm they had caused. A simple apology would not fix the damage that had been done, nor would it erase the years of prejudice that had led to this moment. She could see that the judge was uncomfortable, and for a fleeting second, she wondered if he had any real sense of remorse, or if he was just trying to save face. But she wasn't here to judge him. She wasn't here to make him feel better. She was here because the system needed to change, because his bias was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger problem that affected countless lives every day. The courtroom had become silent as everyone awaited the next step. The tension in the air was palpable, but the woman stood still, unwavering. She knew that this moment would be a turning point, not just for her, but for the people who would see what had happened here today. The judge's realization was just the beginning. He had been forced to confront his own biases, but the true work was still ahead. The system, as a whole, needed to change, and she would do everything in her power to ensure that it did. As the judge stood there, still trying to find the right words, he understood, deep down, that his apology would never be enough to undo the harm he had done. But perhaps, just perhaps, It could be the start of something greater, something that would lead to real change. The woman had made it clear that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, for everyone who had ever been dismissed or underestimated. And in that moment, she knew that the battle for justice was far from over. As the judge sat back, his thoughts in turmoil, the woman remained calm. She had known the moment would come when her identity would be revealed, but the shock on the judge's face still stirred something inside her. She had spent years of her life in the shadows, often underestimated, and for good reason. People only saw the surface. It wasn't just because she was black or a woman, but because she carried herself with such quiet strength that many couldn't recognize the depth of her story. Her journey wasn't one of privilege or ease. She had grown up in a neighborhood where dreams often died young, where opportunities seemed out of reach for those who looked like her. But she had never accepted that reality. She fought against the odds, built her life from the ground up, and succeeded in ways few could imagine. She didn't do it for recognition, nor did she seek glory. But now, in this moment, she realized that her fight was never just for herself. It was for everyone who had ever been overlooked, for everyone who had ever been judged too quickly, too harshly. She thought back to the many times she had faced judgment without mercy, to the countless moments when people assumed they knew who she was based on her appearance, her background, or the way she carried herself. In those moments, she had chosen to stay silent, to stay focused on what mattered, her purpose, her goals, her desire to make a difference in the world. But today was different. Today, the judge had learned who she truly was, and his reaction was a reflection of the bias that still ran rampant in so many corners of society. The woman's name wasn't just known in her community. It was recognized by those who were working to break down the barriers of injustice, inequality, and racism. She had built a reputation for herself not just as a businesswoman, but as an advocate, a philanthropist, and a leader in the fight for social justice. Her work had changed lives, created opportunities, and opened doors that had long been closed. But no one had told the judge that. To him, she had just been another defendant. To him, she was simply someone who had fallen through the cracks, someone to be punished without question. As she stood before him, she didn't feel the need to boast about her accomplishments. She didn't need to explain who she was or what she had done. She had always let her work speak for itself, and today was no different. The judge's reaction told her all she needed to know. His assumptions were rooted in something deeper than just his role in the courtroom. His biases ran through his decisions, shaping how he viewed people like her. And today, he had been forced to see the truth. The judge, still reeling from the realization of his mistake, looked at the woman again, this time with a mix of respect and disbelief. He had been wrong, and in that moment, he knew that the system had failed him, just as it had failed countless others. But his understanding was only the beginning. There was so much more to be done. As the woman looked at him, she didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel the need to rub her success in his face. What mattered to her was that he now understood the weight of his actions, that for once he had been forced to question his own biases. She knew that the journey ahead was long, and that one apology, one moment of realization, wouldn't be enough to fix everything. But it was a start, a crack in the wall that had, until now, stood firm against change. She didn't just want to change the judge's mind. She wanted to change the system. She wanted to create a world where no one had to fight as hard as she had to be seen for who they truly were. And in that moment, she knew her work was far from over. But the judge's recognition of his mistake was a sign that things could and would change, and she would be there, every step of the way, to make sure of it. As the judge continued to absorb the weight of his mistake, the silence in the courtroom was thick with tension. The woman stood there, unwavering, not giving him any indication of her thoughts. She wasn't here to hear empty apologies. She was here because she had a mission to make sure that people like the judge would no longer be able to act out of bias without facing the consequences. She knew the judge's apology didn't fix anything. It couldn't. The harm had already been done. not just to her, but to countless others who had been treated unfairly simply because of their race, gender, or background. The judge, now painfully aware of how wrong he had been, was trying to find the right words. He struggled with the apology, his voice faltering, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was obvious that he understood that he could not undo his actions, but he felt compelled to at least try. He wanted to make amends, to somehow right his wrong. But he also knew that words, no matter how sincere, could never erase the injustice that had been done. The woman didn't respond immediately. She knew that this moment was pivotal. The judge's apology was more of a reflection of his discomfort than a genuine understanding of the consequences of his actions. She had heard apologies like his before, from people who had no true understanding of what it meant to be on the receiving end of prejudice. People who thought that simply saying sorry could smooth things over. She had learned that true change came not from apologies, but from actions. She had been fighting for justice her entire life, and she knew that one moment of realization, even if it was important, wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply feel guilty. There had to be a willingness to change, to take responsibility for the larger system that allowed these biases to thrive unchecked. The judge waited for her response, but the woman remained still, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't going to make him feel better by forgiving him in an instant. Instead, she wanted him to understand the significance of the moment. She wasn't just here for herself. She was here for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or mistreated. Her silence spoke louder than any words could. She was giving him the space to reflect, to understand that this wasn't just about his mistake in the courtroom. It was about the larger implications of how the system operated, how people in power like him could perpetuate harm, often without even realizing it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was a strength in it that could not be ignored. "I appreciate your apology," she said, but she didn't stop there. But apologies won't change the system. Apologies won't change the lives of people who are judged before they even have a chance. Apologies won't make sure this doesn't happen again. The judge, now visibly shaken, nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He had thought that simply acknowledging his mistake would be enough, but now he realized that the work ahead was far greater than he had ever imagined. His position of power meant that he had a responsibility, not just to dispense the law, but to understand the human lives behind the cases he handled. The woman's words were a reminder that change needed to come from within, from the people who had the power to make it happen. She wasn't here for his apology. She was here to make sure the system began to recognize and correct the injustices that were woven into its fabric. She wasn't going to let one apology, no matter how sincere, distract her from her mission. The judge, for the first time in a long while, felt something more than his usual authority. He felt the weight of his responsibility. It was clear now that the journey to true justice would not be easy. It would require more than just changing the way he saw the woman in front of him. It would require changing the way he saw everyone who came into his courtroom, and that change would need to start with him. As the courtroom emptied, the woman's presence lingered in the air. She hadn't just left a mark on the judge. She had left a message for everyone in the room. Change was not a passive process. It was active, intentional, and it required more than just recognition. It required action. She had taken the first step today, and now it was time for the judge and the system to follow suit. The fallout from the judge's biased decision spread quickly. Word of what had happened in the courtroom became the talk of the community, the media, and even the legal world. The judge's mistake couldn't be ignored, and it wasn't just the fact that he had wrongfully sentenced a woman. It was the deeper issue of how he had let his prejudices cloud his judgment. His actions were a stark reminder of how deep-seated bias could influence the decisions of those in positions of power. But the woman, despite the shock of the situation, didn't focus on the judge's misstep for too long. She had bigger goals in mind. This moment was just one example of a much larger problem. It wasn't just about her being unfairly judged. It was about the system that allowed this to happen over and over again, to so many others. She knew that the court of public opinion might be quick to pass judgment on the judge, but real change would require more than a single case to be resolved. It would require a shift in the way society saw fairness, the way people understood justice, and the way they saw each other. Over the following weeks, the woman became a voice for change. She didn't need to be vindicated by the judge's apology. She was already too far ahead of him. Her work in the community, her contributions to breaking down barriers for marginalized groups, and her tireless advocacy for social justice had already spoken volumes. But now, with the public's attention turned toward the incident in the courtroom, she was using this moment to push forward with her vision for change. She was speaking at events, participating in interviews, and sharing her story in the hopes that it would inspire others to join her in challenging a broken system. The judge, on the other hand, found himself under intense scrutiny. The public outcry was fierce, and the legal system had to take action. He was faced with an internal investigation, and his once certain confidence had been replaced by self-doubt. He had never imagined that a single case could have such a lasting impact on his career, but now he was forced to confront his own biases, both in his decision-making and in his personal life. It was a humbling experience for a man who had spent years in a position of power, rarely questioning his actions. In the midst of the controversy, something unexpected happened. The woman did not seek to destroy the judge's career. She didn't want to see him punished. Instead, she wanted him, and everyone who would listen, to learn. She wanted the justice system to acknowledge that the way things had always been done wasn't working. It wasn't enough to apologize. Real change required real work. For her, this was an opportunity to build bridges, not to burn them. Her message was clear. The fight wasn't about one person, one case, or one mistake. It was about the millions of people who had suffered because of systemic bias and injustice. The conversation had started, but it needed to keep going. The judge's revelation, though important, was just the tip of the iceberg. The real work would require everyone involved: judges, lawyers, lawmakers, and citizens, to take a hard look at their own assumptions and understand the lives of the people who walked through their doors, the lives that were shaped by experiences far different from their own. As the weeks passed, changes began to take shape. The judge, though not without his faults, started to engage with the very issues that had once blinded him. He began attending seminars on bias and fairness, listening to experts who could guide him through his own personal growth. He became a part of the conversation, not because he had all the answers, but because he understood that he was part of the problem, and he wanted to be part of the solution. The woman's advocacy didn't end with the judge's reflection. It continued to grow, gaining momentum, as more and more people joined her cause. She spoke about reform, about the need to ensure that those who entered the legal system weren't subjected to the same kind of biases that had almost ruined her life. She inspired others to rise up, to fight for equality, to ensure that no one would ever be treated the way she had been. The moment in the courtroom, the judge's error, and his subsequent realization were just the beginning of something much larger. It was a turning point in the fight for true justice, a fight that would continue long after the media frenzy had died down. And through it all, the woman remained at the center, not seeking revenge, but seeking a better world for everyone. For her, this was the start of a new chapter, not just for herself, but for the countless others who would benefit from the change she was helping to create.